This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you, who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the Greek interpreter interpreted, the Norwood builder built, and the Reigate squires puzzled, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
How many disguises did Sherlock Holmes use? What were the street Arabs? And how did he get information from his underground network?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 372, An Essex Adventure. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you feeling adventurous today, Bert?
Oh, yes, I'm ready for my adventure. Absolutely, Doctor. Plug me in.
Well, this is, once again, one of those episodes that we're doing every month now in Season 8 that looks into Sherlockian travel. That is not the travel of Sherlockians, but rather travel within the Sherlock Holmes canon. Kind of a there and back again. And this is a wonderful concept for a series that you had this year, particularly as it relates to a longtime friend of the show, or at least longtime friend of the hosts of the show, John Besh. And, John's passing last November kind of leaves a hole in many Sherlockians' hearts. And there's a memorial service for John happening in early March in the Baltimore area. From what I understand, a lot of people are going to go to that and honor John, who was an avid Amtrak employee and enthusiast for many years. So how appropriate that we get to honor his memory with this little series that you managed to scrape up for us.
Oh, excellent.
Well, the show notes for this episode can be found at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. All of the links to where you can find us online are available there, as well as at Linktree/Trifles. Excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Linktree/I Hear of Sherlock. That contains all the links for us and our sister show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And, of course, if you support us on Patreon, you get ad-free versions of the show and extra thank you gifts and community bonuses just for you, our Patreon supporters. And at the end of every month, we do a drawing for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal. Nothing you need to do if you are a supporter on Patreon or on Substack. You automatically get entered for a chance to win. So check that out in our show notes. Okay, an Essex Adventure. We find ourselves in Essex. Give us a little background on this, Bert. How is it that we find ourselves in Essex, and how do we find ourselves in an Essex Adventure specifically?
Well, we find ourselves in Essex because of a tactic that repeats occasionally in the cases of Sherlock Holmes. And this particular tactic is the idea of getting an individual out of their premises, away from their house long enough so that a thorough investigation of the premises, a search, can take place. But in the case of the retired colorman, this is done really rather dramatically from the standpoint of the reader. You, the reader, are looking at these events, and suddenly the client is presented with a telegram from a previously unknown vicar in a far distant part of England that says, if you come and visit me, I can tell you something about your problems. And this is taken to Sherlock Holmes, who, of course, advises him to go immediately. Well, the guilty client, who knows better, of course, says to Holmes, well, this is completely improbable. I don't think I shall go. And Holmes says, well, if you refuse to investigate such an obvious potential solution, that will go down very poorly in my eyes and in the eyes of the police. Well, of course, at that point, the client says, oh, yes, well, I hadn't thought of that. And off he goes in the company of Dr. Watson. And the wonderful thing about the Essex Adventure is that the writer of this, A. Godfrey Hunt, in the Sherlock Holmes Society of London Journal, asks a question that had never occurred to me. Now, there are many questions in the world that have never occurred to me, but unlocks a world of detail and information by asking this simple question. And the simple question was, why Essex?
That is a good question, of all places. And I think, as we look at this particular article, it's just a wonderful example of what some of our Sherlockian or Holmesian compadres in England can do because they have access to not only these locations, but also to the many resources that will inform them about what it was like traveling back then and what are some of the nuances of, intercity or intertown travel within areas of England. So it's going to turn out to be a wonderful example of that level of Sherlockian detective work that goes into building a case for a particular thesis.
Yeah, it really does. And also, in Britain, you have many people, like the author of this particular paper, who are fascinated about railways. Railroads were transformative in England, and along the way, parts of the country that had never been connected found themselves connected by various routes to London. And it gives you the opportunity to stroll through the countryside with this particular author and see these magnificent stations, the names of the villages that are unique and enjoyable all their own. It's really quite remarkable. And Godfrey Hunt begins his journey here with very wonderful pointing to specific aspects of the cases of Sherlock Holmes. So he basically starts by saying, well, okay, Watson got up on the morning of 28th of July. Now, this is because he's referring to the Baring Gould chronology. And Holmes was already out. And his note said that he'd be back by 3 p.m. Well, says Godfrey Hunt, we know that he had been previously involved in the case of Hilton Cubitt. And Holmes tells us in the case of the retired colorman that he was also occupied with the case of the two Coptic patriarchs, a matter which should come to a head on the Thursday. And I've always loved that case. And on his own admission later, he told Watson that the way the telegram was produced was he sent an agent, unnamed agent, to Mossmore, come Little Purlington, a wonderful name, to dispatch a telegram allegedly from the vicar J.C. Ellman, M.A. And presumably he could not have gone himself and been back in time for 3 p.m.
And this is where we find that, just as you were talking about before, that Holmes has this suggestion that he should get Amberley out of the way. So this wild goose chase is what he came up with. And there was little time to lose because, as Hunt writes, the investigation needed to be made soon, even the next day. And a train journey seemed like a fine idea. A train starting in the late afternoon would give Holmes enough time to get Amberley from Lewisham to Baker Street and then on to his supposed destination. And as you mentioned there, this is taking place in late July, according to William S. Baring Gould in his chronology. And the July evenings were still long, which was helpful, Hunt writes, because the journey should start in daylight. Amberley might otherwise delay going or find some other excuse, such as telegraphing for more details.
Yeah, and immediately we dig into the wonderful world of British railways, along with a little bit of a fast shuffle from the author here, but it's perfectly acceptable. The fast shuffle is he says, okay, so Holmes is there thinking about exactly the route that he should put Amberley on. Should it be north, east, south, or west of London? He recalled, says the author, a remote part of Essex. Oh, okay, fine. The Tendring Hundred south of Harwich and behind Walton-le-Soken, to give it its traditional name. The developing town of Frinton was nearby, and a look into his Bradshaw. Bradshaw is the great directory of train schedules. For trains from Liverpool Street to Walton soon provided him with what he sought, an afternoon train that took 2 hours to arrive at its destination and was too late for an evening return. And the name of the destination, well, his map of Essex suggested that Mossmore-cum-Little Purlington was remote enough from the railway station to satisfy his timing.
That's great. And then, well, the question, of course, becomes, well, who is he going to visit when he's going on this wild goose chase? It can't be the police, because the police are going to be busy investigating Amberley's supposition that there was a burglary in his native Lewisham. So you can't send him to police in Little Purlington. So who could it be? Who could it be? And of course, a churchman, right? This is where another handy resource of Victorian England comes to use, a Crockford. Crockford's Clerical Directory. And all you have to do is check the name of the parish, and you can find the name of the vicar or the reverend there. And J.C. Ellman was there under the Little Purlington Directory.
So Holmes does all this before he goes to bed that evening. He looks in his Bradshaw, finds a place, looks in Crockford, finds a particular vicar. The next morning, he goes in search of a suitable messenger, an anonymous messenger. We don't know who this was. But once found, the messenger was dispatched to Liverpool Street with very strict instructions as to traveling, and with a suitably worded telegram in his pocket. Holmes tells him, ensure that it is handed in after lunch, and then return to me immediately. Out the messenger goes on the morning train. He arrives at lunchtime. He eats his lunch in the village. He finds the telegraph office. He dispatches the message. He waits and watches the actual sending of it. At 2:10 p.m., he walks back to the railway station, catches an afternoon train, and he arrives back at Baker Street and Sherlock Holmes after 6 p.m. and reports to Holmes, who told him that all was going to plan, and that Dr. Watson was at that very time accompanying their client into furthest Essex. And this is just lovely here. See, all the details have been filled in perfectly plausibly, and it really adds a lovely dimension to the case.
It really does. And at this point in our timeline, we have Holmes then wiring the vicar and announce the forthcoming visit. And, of course, Watson and Amberley were getting ready to finish their train journey at about 7:30. And after they had to change at Colchester onto the Tendring Hundred branch line for the Walton and Clacton trains. This is where a wonderful timetable of railway schedules that's laid in this article makes it very clear when all of these connections were happening. They were fortunate to find a cab to drive them to the vicarage 2 miles away. Time was slipping away for them, and they didn't leave the vicarage until well after 8 o'clock. And what does that mean? Well, it means the telegraph office was closed, so they can't get word back to Holmes. And so they walked slowly and limped back to the nearest railway station. And then, guess what? The last return train to London is gone. So they're stuck there and looking for a room at the railway arms.
Well, our author here is now in search of his own railway arms. And how can we nail down this location? And he goes into an extraordinary amount of very pleasant and interesting detail. He takes us through the particular villages and what the names on the map are and where the halls and the churches and the parsonages are. And he finds something that's pretty likely in one spot. King Edward VII is the name of a particular inn, but sadly it's dated 1901, so it can't be an Edwardian construction. He finds another one at Kirby Cross, a suitable old small station that's merely 100 yards away from the Kirby Tavern. This is a mid-Victorian square building. Well, it's not called, obviously, the Railway Arms, but he has a conversation with a retired railwayman, and he gets the information volunteered to him that the Kirby Tavern had formerly been known as...
Drum roll, please.
The Railway Tavern.
Oh, boy. That is amazing. And see, this is just a thing, right? He's done his research, and the 1882 contemporary map that showed the vicinity. He's looked at the building history there, but this amazing run-in with someone who used to work there, a former railwayman who had a connection there and understood the history of the area. This kind of primary research, that doesn't happen here in the United States with respect to Sherlockian scholarship.
No, it's the great advantage. You can visit these locations. And this lovely essay is accompanied by photographs of the various stations. And, of course, as you mentioned, extracts of the Bradshaw, the railway schedule that you can look at. And sadly, of course, our author tells us, I didn't have a Bradshaw for 1898. So I had, unfortunately, to use my 1908 edition. But he finds the right schedule. He finds, what do we find? But there was an afternoon train at 5:30 p.m., merely 5 minutes after Sherlock Holmes's 5:25 timing. One that changed at Colchester to the Tendring 100 branch line for trains to Walton and to the Clacton division of the train, which occurred at Thorpe-le-Soken. So there are many more lovely stations here. And he gives us a proposition that that recreates and represents the journey of Watson and Amberley. They left London at 5:30 p.m. They alighted at Thorpe-le-Soken station at 7:21 p.m. They took a cab to the vicarage. They stayed overnight at the Railway Arms, which is now the Kirby Tavern, and they returned the following day on the second train back to London.
Yeah, and here's an interesting wrinkle for anyone who's read this story. It happens very late in the canon. However, it is not necessarily timed as late as some of the other stories that took place in, say, 1901, 1903, or 1914. But what we do have is the very first recorded use of the telephone by Sherlock Holmes. And we've got, Watson making a call from a remote Essex village to the greatest metropolis in the world. What could be simpler? Well, and here's where we get into Mr. Hunt's exploration of telephone exchanges in rural and metropolitan London. The provision of a rural telephone service had always presented particular problems, he writes. Of course, in those days, there were manual switches that operators handled. There was no automatic exchange. And that meant you had to have a full-time operator there who could manage the switchboard. And very few villages in 1898 had a call office. And it's unlikely, he says, that Kirby-le-Soken, or for that matter, Moss Morecambe Little Purlington, was so fortunate. So it's not a big surprise that Kirby did not have a telephone exchange until well after 1905. And so if there had been a call office in Kirby, it would have been a link direct to Thorpe. And he says it's not clear that either one had one of those in 1898. So now we have a dilemma in that a telephone call was made by Watson, but that it's most unlikely that there was a telephone at Moss Morecambe Little Purlington at the time. Now, Bert, you worked a good portion of your career in the telephone industry. How are we to solve this?
Well, I worked in the American telephone industry, not the British telephone industry. And of course, this is obviously puzzling for our American listeners who are confronted quite frequently with period dramas taking place in Victorian England, particularly in rural villages, where there seems to be no shortage of red telephone boxes scattered around the countryside. Well, friends, those red telephone boxes come off of trucks sent by the prop department. There were no rural, and you'll notice, by the way, that as they're standing there in the countryside, surrounded by cows and cattle and things like that, there are no wires coming out of them either, because
out of the cows?
No poles, and no poles.
Them either.
The boxes are just sitting there. Because it's a fancy of the prop providers, but the point that our author makes here is that telegrams were much more reliable because there were a greater number of telegraph offices, and there was a well-established process for delivering telegrams in these sorts of villages. But our author does go on, by the way, and investigate the cost of the telephone. He says the use of a telephone call was a last resort, only used because the telegraph office was closed. He would have paid 9p for his call, being less than 75 miles distant and less than 3 minutes in duration. So, and the vicar's message, on the other hand, would have cost a shilling by telegram, being nearly 24 words at the rate of 6p for 12 words.
Well, and that brings to mind another side trifle while we're talking about the retired colorman. You've got the cost of the telegrams. You've got the cost of the telephone calls. You've got the cost of the train travel. You've got the cost of the overnight at the railway arms. And our perpetrator, who is also our client, tends to be, well, a cheapskate, shall we say.
Yeah.
How would Holmes expect to be reimbursed for any of these costs?
Yeah, he wouldn't.
He ate it on this one. There was no fee that I know of.
No, and nobody offering a reward. And in fact,
no.
His hated rival who collars him at one point is investigating
Barker,
this because of other people who have been interested in the demise or the disappearance of one of the characters associated with this tragedy.
Right.
So now it's possible that there could have been a reward there, but in that case, it really would have accrued to Barker rather than Holmes himself. So this is, as you say, a loss in count books. If Holmes was keeping count books for his practice, this sadly was red ink.
Well, we are all the richer for people like A. Godfrey Hunt, who go on the hunt to bring us into the trifling details in the traveling, the travels of Watson and of Amberley, and of Holmes.
Yes, and it's all just a really charming trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Did I really do remarkably badly?
Yes.